Hi everyone. In this video, I collaborate with British astrologer Dan Waits. His YouTube channel called WORLD Astrology Report focuses primarily on mundane astrology, which is the branch of astrology that studies events of geographical regions, places, countries, and literally the entire world in an attempt to find meaningful patterns throughout history and especially in what they may predict about current times. Dan also publishes monthly forecasts on his channel and is available to see clients for private consultations. Currently, he is focused on understanding the astrology of the 2020s, particularly the rather incredible planetary configurations we will see in 2026. I can tell you that this was a fascinating conversation that we both really enjoyed, and I'm confident you will enjoy it as well.
Right. So what I'm really focused on in my astrology is sort of big picture, big transits, like historical perspective and that kind of thing. I am a consulting astrologer. I see clients, and I, do the same kind of astrology that a lot of us do. But what really interests me is this kind of the big picture and understanding history and historical processes. So what my kind of obsession is really just kind of understanding where are we in history, what are the processes that are going on that explain why the world looks as it does right now, and then also trying to maybe figure out where things are going. But obviously prediction on this kind of scale is really difficult. But what I found is that looking at big planetary cycles, they do I think enable you to do some kind of prediction, because as a cycle goes on, as a cycle begins at a conjunction and then planets make aspects with each other, you can see what's happening at each point in a cycle. And you can start to get a picture of, what is this cycle about? What are the big themes? Because what I've really found is that cycles tell stories. There's a story that, there's a seed at a conjunction. Some sort of story is seeded, and it's not always completely obvious to human beings what that story is. But astrology, planetary cycles, and looking at history can enable us to kind of look back and say, okay, I can see what story was being told by that cycle.
Good point. Yeah, those are great points. I mean, you can think of two that come to mind immediately, although I'm sure you'll be talking about this, but in the Saturn-Neptune cycle, so the Saturn-Neptune will be conjoining in 2025, 26. They were conjoined in the last civil war, or the one and only civil war in the US, so that's something to remember. And also, I noticed, I'm pretty sure 1917, so you could connect that to the First World War, correct? As an example of patterns that repeat where you think, gulp, these two planets, and what they might do, significant in conjunction, right?
Yeah, 100%, exactly. So looking back at, what have previous Saturn-Neptune conjunctions done? What have we seen in the world? That can tell us an awful lot. And yeah, as you say, those are some of the things that happened in previous Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. The one that's coming in 2026 looks really interesting, because it's happening in February of that year at 0 degrees of Aries. This is the first degree of the entire zodiac, which symbolically is pretty interesting, right? It's
definitely, yeah. That's an unusual degree for sure. I wonder how many hundreds or thousands of years before you get a conjunction like that at 0 Aries. It's probably impossible to calculate.
Yeah, I mean, so I made a video about this cycle last year with another astrologer, S.J. Anderson. We did a fair bit of research into this cycle, and using our software, we couldn't find any other conjunctions going back thousands of years at that exact degree. There have been others, like in very, in Aries have been quite a lot, and then in very early Aries, There have been some other ones, but yeah, right at that degree, you just can't find one. So it's kind of incredible.
Yeah, this is probably gonna fill the books then for the next decades, because astrologers talk a lot about the 0 degree point and how significant it is, and then they can refer back to this major conjunction right after it goes through. So yeah, very interesting, definitely, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's you have to wonder what it might mean. If the zodiac is the story of life from kind of birth to in Aries to rejoining the ocean of consciousness, say in Pisces, then then what's the first degree of Aries is surely the moment of birth, if it's
true.
It's anything.
Very true. Very true. The only Aries, because that's what we're talking about now. I did notice that there was one conjunction of Saturn-Neptune, because if you look at the Civil War or you look at the 17, both of those you have to count them as negative. The 1989 conjunction in Capricorn, you could perhaps point the other way to a certain change in governmental patterns that, at least in the near term then, appeared to be very positive. But that's Capricorn, this is Aries, so it's a totally different thing.
Yeah. So these conjunctions will probably express themselves, as you say, differently in different signs. And Saturn-Neptune, it's a tricky combination, right? Because Saturn and Neptune are two very different planets. They're almost kind of, in certain sense, they're almost opposites, really. If Saturn is concrete and Neptune is diffuse and sort of ineffable.
Hard to pin down. Wasn't it? I'm trying to remember. You might remember this. Andre Barbeau, another astrologer who was really adept at these big world cycles. I think he correlated, if I'm not mistaken, Saturn-Neptune. He thought was either China or the Soviet Union. It was one of those two, because I'm pretty sure he had Saturn-Uranus was a U.S. correlation, and Saturn-Pluto might have been China, or I can't remember which of those two, but Saturn-Neptune was one of those two countries. Do you recall which one it was?
Yes. So Saturn-Neptune is really tightly correlated with Russian history.
Okay, there you go. Right. Yeah, see, that's fascinating. That's really fascinating, because notice who's in charge. There's the president right now, their mob boss, so to speak. He is, that's what that's my perception of Russian government, but he's a Libra with lots of planets in Libra. And the conjunction is happening on the other side of that. So.
Yeah, well, he was, if I'm not mistaken, he was born at around the time of the last, there were conjunctions in 1952 and 53 in Libra. Putin was born.
Yes, that's right.
At that time.
Around that time.
It's kind of interesting that, that we're coming to another one of these conjunctions. It's really synced with Russian history, because you can look at 1917, you have the Russian Revolution, you have 52, you have the death of Stalin, you have the next one's coming 89, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Exactly. So
you can the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that those four right there, they give you the arc of history for Russia almost precisely. So maybe Andre was onto something. No, I always wonder, how did he figure this out? Because it's quite brilliant, that he would link the planets that way. Yeah, very.
Yeah, I mean, Andre Barbeau, he's probably one of the couple of the biggest influences on what I do. I mean, everything that I'm doing, pretty much I owe to his work, because my approach is a little bit similar, and I was really inspired by his work. But yeah, he's I think he may have been one of the first people to see that pattern. What's really interesting actually is it goes back even further. It goes back into deep history, and you can go even to, what's interesting is the last time there was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries, which is where we're getting this next conjunction in 2026, 1703. That was a really big year for Russian history. That was the year of the founding of St. Petersburg.
Okay, that's amazing. That's excellent. Wow. So even more.
Yeah. So Peter the Great, the Tsar, he was trying to modernize Russia, and he founded this completely new city St. Petersburg at that time. So it was a big moment of, I guess you could say, initiation, which is quite obviously Aries.
Yeah.
It really initiated a new phase of Russian history. So I think it's fairly safe to say that 2026 is going to be very big for Russia. Big new beginning, big ending, maybe both at the same time, which is obviously what we see at conjunctions often. But Russia is undoubtedly going to be seriously implicated. I think it would be amazing if it wasn't. Something else that I looked at is around this time in 1703. The last time we had one of these conjunctions in Aries, in Iceland, of all places, they made the first known census, or the first modern census. It was something like that. I know that the Romans used to do censuses, but if you look at, there was some sense in which it was a kind of a new thing, the way that they did a census of all the people in Iceland at that time. And that's kind of interesting with Aries. It's the sign in which the sun is exalted, identity. And so that's also making me think a bit about what might be coming, because I don't know if you've heard much about Sam Altman, the OpenAI CEO. He has this other project called WorldCoin, which is basically, it's kind of this crazy sounding scheme where they want to scan everybody's eyeballs to create like unique identifiers that you can then use on the internet. So that basically it's possible to know exactly who everyone is on the internet, and everyone has to line up and scan their eyeballs in these weird devices. Wow. It's insane, but it sounds insane. But there's some sense to that's kind of thing that I'm sort of wondering about when I hear that there was this census, the first census in modern times in 1703, and if you think about thematically, we might get some echo of that with this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, because the Neptune is kind of universal, right? It's the ocean, everybody basically, and this is why it's also associated with communism and socialism, because there's this kind of universalism. Let's kind of make everybody the same and kind of give everybody the same rights and perks and all that kind of stuff. And Saturn is kind of like, well, let's structure this. Let's kind of figure out what's really there. Let's kind of identify everybody. That's something I've just, that just occurs to me as a possibility. I mean, it's possible to know for sure.
It makes a lot of sense, because Saturn and the idea of governance or organizing something, you can think of government as Saturn something rather than Saturn by itself. And Neptune, I totally agree. I always see Uranus and Neptune as the two planets that promote democracy and, in one form or another, through granting the individual more power in the organization. So that makes a lot of sense that in the Saturn-Neptune would correlate with that. Or when we talk later about Uranus connections as well, because once you bring in Uranus and AI and the whole technological thing, it gets connected that way as well. But that's fascinating in Iceland. I mean, did it go anywhere else, or just that was it? That was the place where this census idea.
I haven't. Well, I haven't looked deeply into it actually. This is something I just found quite recently, because I spend a lot of time just kind of looking at Wikipedia and trying and figuring out kind of finding these little events and stuff. So it's definitely a thread to trace, which I plan to do. But maybe, I mean, it's definitely listed on there as kind of the first modern census. So I presume that that idea then caught on from there, because obviously everyone's doing it these days. But
was Iceland back then, as this is a pre 17, you said 1703, correct? So that's the the democracy started to become more popular maybe 100 years later. Was Iceland already in some way a little more progressive, or like what could even have led to them doing a census like that? It doesn't seem like a monarchic thing. It seems like someone thought about the group and what benefits all of us, and then launched the initiative.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about Iceland, if in all honesty,
Unsurprisingly, right?
but
And neither
but
do I. I know.
but if I may be wrong, but if I remember correctly, I think it's Iceland is known as having one of the earliest parliaments
Oh,
in
okay.
the
There you go. Right, right. There you go. So that's probably, yeah, that's the way. Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool because they're like at the forefront of that movement that was, coming online, so to speak, over the next century, 2 centuries. Yeah, it's phenomenal. So, but
yeah.
I wonder with that, but now in the current, so how would you project that? What's a guess to say on that level? Because we're not talking Russia now, we're talking on the level of, um, the rights of the individual, the rights of the state, all those things. What could be a possible manifestation of that in the mid part of the decade?
Yeah, I mean, it's something. It's a difficult question. I'm not sure about how it pertains to rights. As I mentioned, I always had that theory about kind of identity.
Identity,
Um,
right?
I also wonder, in a more general level, about some the instigation of some new kind of like universal system, or perhaps something to do. I also wonder about AGI, or like some sort of artificial intelligence system. There's some sense, you hear a lot of talk about this. They're essentially, if you listen to some of these AI people, they talk about how they're creating some sort of new form of intelligence, some new life form and stuff. And it's hard for us, like laymen, to know like kind of how realistic that is, and is that nonsense? I mean, I think those of us that believe in the spirit and the soul are a bit sort of skeptical, maybe, about that. But there's something else that makes me think about is, if Neptune could be seen as some sort of as spirit, and Saturn is kind of concreteness. So there's the other image that I have in my mind is something around kind of incarnation of some sort of like intelligence, perhaps, that maybe you could kind of see the pace that AI is advancing. Perhaps that there's the creation of some sort of system or something around that time, which then becomes like seen as really foundational and important in history.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, that would be
hmm,
good. Yeah, I mean, I've often thought about how there is so much possibility with technology to order the world if people were less conspiratorial and suspicious, because no one wants to give their information to anyone, because if you do, then someone can misuse it. But if information were used properly, you can, you can achieve a lot. You can order things, bring things to a new level. But I mean, in the US, even the notion of giving people an identity card is immediately, wait, hold on, this means you can track me. No, even though it should be pretty basic, to be able to identify yourself so you could vote and so forth. But there are all these cross currents circulating, and so it's very difficult. It's almost like the idea that, in a way, it's better to have cameras everywhere watching everything if everybody were honest. But unfortunately, people aren't. So then it leads to all kinds of other problems. Because on the plus side, having more of that, for instance, allows law enforcement to solve more crimes, things like that. But eventually people complain because they don't want to be identified. And it's the same with any technology. If what you say is right, wonderful, but people will say, wait a second. Now this artificial intelligence can control everything I do, and I don't like it, and then you'll get battles. So yeah, that's the thing.
yeah. I think I mean, the reality is, not everybody has that much trust in government. Some people do, some people don't. And I'm personally a little bit worried about AI for this reason. What worries me about it really is how it will kind of grant governments the ability to know who everyone is and exactly what everybody thinks, because up till now, I mean, it's generally the case, like they're not investigating everybody, right? They tend to be investigating people they think are troublemakers or are criminals, or that kind of thing, because they have to actually have human beings following the data and looking at people and making judgments and thinking about what they're doing.
Right.
But AI kind of gives them infinite potential to just literally look into everybody. What's this person saying, and in social media, what are they doing, where are they going, who are they associating with? If it becomes possible to put these data sets together, put it into an AI, then you can imagine it can gain a really quite a good model of like who you are, what you believe, what you're doing, and in a world with a completely benevolent government, then great. If we knew that the government was completely benevolent, but not, I think it's fair enough to have some skepticism that sometimes there are, the governments don't always have your best interests at heart, and there is the corrupting influence of money and power involved in things. So it kind of worries me a little bit. And that's the kind of the nature of the moment, right? There's great potential and great risk. That's how I see it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, you can see how, I saw this thing where already on these because these are now new websites, new engines, and they're only starting. So give it 5 years and they'll be way more accurate. So there's this one where you plug in a video or an audio, and in a matter of seconds, it summarizes everything that is being said. So just picture that evolving. And if people take all of your videos, they'll know exactly what you think, how you think. So now project that to the population. You could see a corrupt politician tailoring their message to where people are and trying to manipulate something. In other words, it could be great, but it could also be incredibly problematic if it isn't well regulated and there aren't good counterpoints. And we know what that's like in government. To implement such things is, at least in most modern democracies, nearly impossible because people start arguing about the pros and cons. So yeah, full agreement on that one.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of to follow what you say. It also what's interesting about it is it kind of like the logic of this technology leads towards maybe the need for people to be able to identify themselves as human beings. If we have AIs that are so good that they can just, they can point an AI at your channel, Andre, and just say, copy, paste. And suddenly they have you, and it's making new episodes of your channel, and it's analyzed everything you've ever said, and is sort of, who knows how good this stuff can get. Can it do a really good, basically almost perfect impression of you? And so, if that's where we're going, then you can see why there's going to be a push for like, well, we have to be able to identify, is this the real Andre? Is this the real Dan? Is this the real whoever? And then the logic of it maybe points in the direction of this kind of like identification stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And that you can see right there where how incredibly complicated and dangerous it would become if not well managed. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So this is now it's all Saturn-Neptune so far, right? That we've focused on. Right.
Yeah. So I mean, Saturn-Neptune is, that conjunction in 2026 is already extremely interesting, but that year not only has that particular conjunction, but it has another configuration which is also just quite extraordinary. And maybe I can show you actually.
Sure,
share my screen, and we can show you this configuration. It's coming like just after that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So I'm going to share my Astro Gold with you. Can you see that? Yeah.
Okay, so that is showing. So that there, the Saturn has already separated some from Neptune, right? The way you're showing it.
Yeah. So this is this is July 2026. July. So okay. You can see that Saturn has separated a few degrees, 10 degrees from Neptune. But now look at what the other outer planets are doing, and this is really extraordinary. So we've got Neptune at 4 degrees there, but then we also have Pluto at 4 degrees of Aquarius. We have Uranus at 4 degrees of Gemini. So just those 3 outer planets there, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus, they're in what we call a minor grand trine. So we have Pluto and Uranus are in a perfect trine. Neptune is kind of at the midpoint between them, sextiling both of those planets. And then just for good measure as well, Jupiter also in July moves opposing Pluto at 4 degrees of Leo as well. So we have, except for Saturn, we have all those slow moving planets at 4 degrees in this really incredible configuration. My collaborator, I do quite a lot of work with, S.J. Anderson, he nicknamed this configuration the basket. It's kind of rotated a little bit because I'm using I have Aries as the first house in this chart, but you can kind of see, if you tilt your head a bit, you can see how the configuration does have this basket shape.
Yeah.
And so this is just really incredible, coming in the same year. It's sort of one of the reasons why it just seems like 2026 is going to be some kind of landmark year that people are going to look back on in the future and say, wow, yeah, that was a lot of very interesting stuff happened that year.
It's true. Very true. Very true. That's remarkable. Remarkable that you get that many planets conjoining. And I mean, rather not conjoining, aligning with each other. That's really cool. Yeah.
So it's what's I mean, we mentioned Barbeau already, Andre Barbeau, this famous French astrologer. He predicted the 2020 pandemic, and he was really positive about this configuration. He said he thought it was the best astrology of the 21st century. What he pointed out is that if you look at the different cycles that we're looking at here, there's separate. You can take apart this configuration and just look at what synodic cycles, which are cycles of two planets, are kind of forming part of this. And so you can see that we have, for example, Pluto-Neptune. So that's one synodic cycle. That's in a harmonious sextile. Mm-hmm. So it's an important moment in the Pluto-Neptune cycle. But then we have, Uranus here, Uranus-Neptune, also in a sextile. So this Uranus-Neptune cycle, which began in 1993, that's also reaching a sextile. So it's also in a waxing phase, right? All these cycles are waxing, they're expanding, there's things sort of growing and coming into the world here. Right. And then Pluto-Uranus as well is in a trine. This Pluto-Uranus cycle goes back to 1965, 66, the mid-60s. So that's another cycle. It's in a harmonious waxing aspect. Mm-hmm. So Barbeau thought this was he said it was the most remarkable astrology of the 21st century, and that he thought it was heralding the sort of blooming of some sort of new world civilization that I think he said something like that it was also symbolic of the uplifting of the less fortunate people of the world into some new world civilization somehow. So he's really positive about it and thought it heralded great things. And what he also said was that he thought there was a crisis that would begin in 2020 with a pandemic, which of course it did. He predicted this years in advance. And he thought that the crisis would be over, basically, some sort of world crisis that would be done by this 2026 basket. And then it's kind of like, then the good times roll kind of thing. So that's one very positive vision, really, of this decade. Now, I don't know, I'm not sure he's right.
I was going to say that if we stop there and then that's it, we say no more, then everybody can sleep happy. But then there's more. There are other ways to look at this.
Yeah. I mean, well, firstly, he might be right. Let's bear that in mind,
correct.
Right? He might be right, and he was a great astrologer. So I wouldn't necessarily want to bet against Andre Barbeau. He's an all-time great. He studied astrology all his life. He developed this kind of style of astrology himself that I've kind of sort of doing myself, and so I wouldn't bet against Barbeau. But I'm not. I don't know about you, but you do wonder, like, how can everything be kind of hunky-dory by 2026? It doesn't right now, to me. It seems, just taking the astrology out of it, seems a little bit unlikely that that the world can somehow come together into some new world civilization, as he called it, kind of so quickly. I mean, things are very divided, and it does make you wonder what, if he's right, what would need to happen between now and then to for that to be true.
I have a theory. The theory could be, if you see the situation right now, there appears to be a bit of a battle between conventional, Western democracy, something that comes out of the last 200 years, where the individual gains more and more power, but there's still the group, the government, and so forth. But there are countries like China, Russia, or any country where there is anybody that is an actual or an aspiring fascist. It's the opposite approach, where you're taking the Viking approach, or the idea of a monarch, someone being in charge. Now, if, as we go into the middle of the decade, those impulses are either checked, or greatly or partly or mostly checked, so that democracy is reinforced, you could get a period of growth and development. Because if the world goes the other way, people are scared all the time. What happens if the Chinese system is successful, or the Russian system, and so forth? That, in my opinion, would not be good. I know I'm biased because I'm defending the system I live in, but to me it appears to be, it's better in that there's more freedom. If you want to use the keyword that is, in my opinion, most explicitly connected to Uranus, Neptune, freedom for the individual. If you take that away, then that would not be this. That would not be the potential. And even if that were true, that doesn't mean things become, by any means perfect. It just means it's a step in the right direction. That's one possibility. Other than that, I agree with you, though, because based on the current patterns we're seeing, it seems pretty improbable, that things would be utopian, certainly. I don't see utopia at all. That, to me, feels completely unrealistic. That unrealistic, I know, is a Saturn word, but Saturn has to kind of put its stamp of approval on things in the end, and it seems unrealistic. Yes.
Yeah, Saturn always gets a big say.
Yeah, well, because Saturn is the order of things, so whatever order we land on, whatever you color it with, it's still Saturn, and the idea that it has to be grounded, workable, and so forth is very important. So, but there is a possibility, because we're seeing that, as well as you're seeing all the problems we're experiencing, you can also see that China's not doing as well as they had expected to do. Russia's certainly not doing as well as they were expecting to do. The US gets a lot of criticism, but where would you rather be at the moment in terms of world powers? I don't see the logic of being in any other place. If there is a conflict or if there's a dispute, the US is still the place to be. Now, there are arguments around that too, including, for example, the US has a huge debt, and yes, I'm aware of all that. It's quite complicated, but overall, I still believe that the world order, remaining democratic, and the power of the democratic world order is stronger. Do you agree with that, or do you feel that there are lots of arguments on the other side?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say I completely agree. I mean, you might be right. Firstly, I would certainly say that it's hard to see exactly how things are going to shake out, but my suspicion is a little bit more that what might come about is a sort of reordering of the global system, not one in which, say, suddenly China rules the world or something, in the same way that the United States has been the most powerful. It's been the sole superpower for quite some time, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. I don't think we're not going to something like that. My suspicion is more that there's just going to be some sort of more of a rebalancing towards a sort of multipolarity. I'm not sure that I find it unlikely. I think that that states like say Russia and China and so on are going to adopt the sort of American system. I don't know if I necessarily believe that all civilizations and kind of are inclined the same way and kind of like to govern themselves the same way. That's not to justify, I'm not trying to justify kind of, the bad stuff that obviously happens in those countries. That's not where I'm coming from at all. But I do think there are maybe differences in styles and sort of what works in different places to an extent. So I wonder if there's going to be some rebalancing towards a more multipolar system. I think, I think the United States is still going to be, a very, very powerful country. And it has so many advantages. It's got like it's a very big country. It's got access to both big oceans, and it's just unfeasible to me that's going to really change in a big way. But at the same time, I do think if there is to be some kind of peaceful outcome to this sort of what's going on now, I'm more hoping that there's going to be some kind of live and let live kind of situation, which actually I personally believe can be beneficial for everybody. We saw, for example, in the Cold War, in my opinion, how the existence of the Soviet Union actually was really helpful to workers' rights, for example, in the West, because there had to be some concessions to kind of to stave off the possibility of things going completely in the other direction. And for me, what I think is important is kind of balance, really, in all things. And I think if one state has too much power, the tendency is, or one person or one entity, the tendency is generally towards, in my opinion, towards corruption. And so I think personally, but this is getting a little bit into what one thinks is good, which is not really
exactly
put that aside, right?
It makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the thing is, though, that there are so many factors in play. For example, when you were talking about AI, part of the problem that these countries that are doing it in let's call it the old style, I sometimes think in Russia they think they're still in 1940. The problem is that technology now moves the information around a lot more quickly. So now I just read this article yesterday in the New York Times. Women in Russia are starting to get really upset because their sons or their husbands are not being returned from their deployments. And because they can move the information around really quickly, they can gang up on the government much more quickly. And in China, the women are not wanting to reproduce, which is a big problem for the Chinese government because they don't want to bring in immigration. So controlling people in a dictatorial way is getting harder and harder. That's my sense, because of technology. So that's something that can really throw things off, because you have to now use that technology and use it to control the people. That's a tricky game, in my opinion. Now, to each his own, but it's harder and harder. Back 100 years ago, you would just print anything, hide things for a decade at a time. No one really knew what happened. It can all be put under the rug. Not so easy anymore. So that's the Uranian, factor exploding, Neptune as well. And that could be a counterpoint. But I can see where you're going to with the fact that I know what you mean. Unless you said, okay, well, this basket here that we're looking at, it establishes, for example, imagine let's be a little utopian for a second here, and imagine that most of the world decided, it's better to tell the truth than to lie. Let's make telling the truth more of a value here that we should all hold to instead of this constant disinformation. Now, that's really tricky because the countries that don't do it that way thrive on that, right? But even if those countries were forced to, literally through technology or whatever, to be more in contact with their people and respect their people a little more and give them more rights, then there would still be differences, because the Chinese culture is different than the American culture, is different than the Russian culture. They'll want to do it in a different way, but at least there's less of a chance that we're going to have a Cold War where I presume you'll bring this up, that, based on past patterns, such as like 75 to, or 76 to 86, the sextile, that was the Cold War. And then, interestingly, that passes and then things got better. So there's a sense that it could be repeated again. Then we're all going to be sitting around wondering when the next missile will land on top of our head from somewhere, which would be a lot more uncomfortable, obviously, right? So this is yeah.
Well, yeah. Should we get into the Pluto-Neptune
sure. Yeah.
cycle, and so we can kind of get into some of that. So the thing that I've been focused on most over the last few months is the Pluto-Neptune cycle. So this is of the kind of standard major planets that we use in mundane astrology. This is the longest, the slowest cycle. So it's about 492 years. Let's just call it 500 years. Every 500 years, Pluto and Neptune can join, and so this is kind of like the reason that I decided to focus on this cycle is I think it's foundational, right? It's the sort of bass notes. If astrology is music, the music of the spheres, then this is the bass note. This is the kind of deepest level. Pluto Neptune cycle, it's really about like really core belief, faith, consciousness, these kind of really big questions which kind of underlie everything. We tend to get lost in politics and geopolitics and so on, but what's often, I think, driving history is our deepest fundamental beliefs, and that's Pluto Neptune speaks to. So this, as you'll see, there's a sextile here, Pluto Neptune. Now, you probably know that this sextile is nothing new. Pluto and Neptune have been in a sextile for a long time, since really the 1940s. But let's just go back to the start of this cycle. So here was the last set of Pluto Neptune conjunctions, 1891. There were 3 of them, so there tends to be 3 hits with these conjunctions because of retrogrades. But the last time they met, so this only happens every 500 years or so, 1891 and 1892, in the sign of Gemini. Now, the way these conjunctions work is actually they kind of move slowly through the signs. So you'll get a few conjunctions in Taurus, say start with Aries, a few conjunctions in Aries, then they move to Taurus and they just creep through. So every 500 years, you get a new conjunction, and you'll get several in each sign. So the way I've seen this is it almost kind of gives us a kind of, a sequence of great ages, where Pluto-Neptune conjunctions are happening in a certain sign. And they moved into Gemini in 1398, 1399, right? So that we start to get the first Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in Gemini. What comes around that time? We start to have the Renaissance, and then we have the Reformation, we have the Enlightenment, we have the sort of scientific revolution. This is really the sort of, if you look, a lot of historians will kind of date the modern era really to around that time, so like the 15th century with the Renaissance in Italy and everything that came after that, Copernicus and Martin Luther and all this stuff. I mean, it was really notable that this was shortly after the first conjunctions in that sign. We have the printing press. It's all very mercurial, and if you see the sort of mercurial nature of our times, it's like unmistakable. The importance of data communication, the fast-moving nature of things. Like, there's no other planet surely that most characterizes the times. And so we had the second set of these conjunctions in 1891, 1892. So this was the kind of seed moment of the big cycle that we're in. And so what I've been looking at is, what happened in this period, the late 19th century, around the time when, not at this exact moment, but just when these planets were in orb, say 15 degrees. That's the orb that Richard Tarnas, who's another astrologer who's done, this kind of work, he uses a 15-degree orb for these conjunctions. So it means that the last sort of quarter of the 19th century is our kind of seed time for our cycle. And so if you look at that period, you see a lot of interesting things happening, a lot of interesting trends beginning. It was a really technologically important time for science and technology. It was like the sort of electrical revolution, right? We had Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla and people like this just electrifying the world. We had the birth of flight around this time. This is the first planes basically came at this time. Radio by Marconi. These kind of technologies that connect the world together that have led to this. Where are we now? We're in this world of like instant connection, quick
Correct.
movement around the world.
Correct.
That it all goes back to this period, with this conjunctional period. And so what I've been looking at is like, well, trying to trace all these different threads that go back to this time. So there's this technological explosion. So it was almost like science started to do magic at this time. It was like magical things. We can now fly because of science and technology. We can speak to each other at great distances because of science and technology, etc. The cinema as well. This is also, you can also take that back to this period. At the same time, there's also an interesting period for like spiritually speaking. We have a kind of occult revival at that time. The theosophy. You could date modern astrology to that time. It was a kind of the astrological revival. The ideas that were coming around then, there was this kind of, with the theosophists and anthroposophists and so on, they were fusing sort of Western esotericism with Eastern ideas in reincarnation, Hinduism, Buddhism, spiritual evolution, all these ideas which have kind of ultimately kind of permeated the world quite deeply. There's so many people who are into, you can really date sort of New Age thinking to this period as well, I think. There's so many people who are, they do yoga, they believe in reincarnation, they're vegetarian, all that stuff really.
Yeah, it's true. It's totally true. Yeah, you're definitely tagging it. Including that. One thing that came to mind is that I always associate Gemini to flying and birds, and the idea of in fact, best story I can think of is this great spiritual master I had the good fortune to hang out with in the 20th century. And this guy was a Gemini, and he actually liked to, he met, was a meditator, obviously, but he would sometimes describe his inner world as flying around, number one. But he would put on wings and throw himself off the side of a mountain to actually experience flying, and he had a falcon that he would land on his, he would train the falcon. So in other words, the bird energy and flying, and then of course, Mercurial, because Mercury and Gemini and so forth. So the printing press, wasn't that also part of the 1399? Was that when it first came online, or was it later? The idea of
it came on. Well, yeah, this is the interesting thing. So it came online. The printing press emerges at the sextile. So the first major aspect of the cycle around the mid 15th century, 1440, 1450, sextile orb, the printing press appears. So this is kind of this is an interesting analog of our time, which I'll get to in a sec when I talk about the sextile. The other interesting thing that was born at this time around these conjunctions is really the birth of atomic nuclear physics. We discovered the electron in 1897, which is pretty, these planets were still well in orb of conjunction at that time. So it's the discovery of the electron, and so it's the first sort of peek into the structure of the atom, which I think ultimately bore fruit in the atomic bomb and nuclear power, things like that. So that's another thread. And the other interesting thread, which I've also been following, is the UFO phenomenon. Also really dates to this time, which is something we're hearing a fair bit about these days. It's kind of exploding into the news quite a bit. In the 1890s, there was this huge wave of sightings of what's called mystery airships in the United States, and then beyond in other parts of the world. There were these strange airships that we didn't really have those kind of airships at the time. They could move very fast. They had very strong searchlights. They had strange occupants who people talked to, and it was kind of the technology that people were experiencing was just ahead of like what we actually had at the time. But these, it was
that's in the 1890s, right?
In the 1890s,
yeah,
yes.
Okay, that I didn't know. That's phenomenal.
Yeah,
fabulous.
And if you read some of the kind of best known, most famous UFO researchers, people like Jacques Vallée, John Keel, these are kind of quite they're kind of serious people they don't get too carried away. They were really concerned with trying to figure out what is going on with this weird phenomenon, and they generally will highlight that time as the kind of moment when these strange appearances start to appear like technology. So it was a technological explosion in human society. But then there are these weird airships appearing that we see. That's a piece of technology. That's how we would perceive it. Now, people generally say, well, perhaps this phenomenon has been around for a long time. People have always seen strange lights in the sky, strange beings, and in all the folklore of the world. But this was the first moment when it started to appear as technology, which is kind of interesting, given that it was also a period of incredible technological growth as well. So that's basically, this is the conjunction. Now, this cycle is very slow, of course, and when these two planets start to get into a sextile, so basically Neptune obviously moves quite a lot faster than Pluto, and so it was roughly in the 1940s when the two planets reached their sextile. Now I've got it.
49 to 59. That decade is pretty much steady sextile, I think, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I have it. Well, I have a chart I can show you. This is from a program called a website called Archetypal Explorer, and it allows you to visualize aspects. Can I maybe I need to actually share this particular window. Can you see this now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there it shows it. It shows it like around 1950. That wave part is the period when they're sextile, right?
Yeah. So what this shows, you can see that this is basically how many degrees Neptune and Pluto are away from the sextile. So you can see the scale on the y-axis goes from 10 to 0. So as soon as you start seeing a line here, they're 10 degrees away from a sextile, and you can see that they get closer and closer through the 1940s. Now, I use a 6-degree orb. Maybe this is what Tarnas uses for sextile. 6 degrees. So you can see that they get within 6 degrees in the early 1940s. Really, you can say that they're in orb from here, where this line comes up. And then these periods where at the top where it's got 0, these are exact sextiles. So between 1950 and 1956, they make a set of exact sextiles. But what you'll see is that actually, you see this line here, this on the right, this line shows this is where we are now. But pretty much for the entire period, since the 1940s, these two planets have been in a sextile. It's been a very long sextile. And the reason for that is that at a certain point in the cycle, Pluto has a very elliptical orbit, eccentric orbit, whatever you want to call it. And at a certain time, i.e. now, it speeds up because it's moving much faster than normal. And it moves at roughly the same speed as Neptune around the zodiac. So there's this, you have these long periods where they're moving at the same speed, so they just stay in the same aspect, which is what we've had basically since the 1940s. So everyone alive today, you, me, pretty much probably almost everybody watching, has a Pluto-Neptune sextile in their natal chart. And I think for a lot of people, myself included, at first thought, well, that doesn't really mean anything then, because it's been in this sextile for so long. Like, what can we really tell from that? And it was really looking at Archetypal Explorer and visualizing this that allowed me to kind of I got some realization about we can actually see something of something's going on with this. There's a bit of structure to what's happening, because you can see that the planets come into sextile in the 1940s. Now, we talked about what was born at the conjunction and what was kind of seeded there. What happens in the 1940s? Well, of course, we have the nuclear bomb, which is very significant nuclear power. 1942, the first controlled fission reaction. Obviously, what happened in 1945, the bombs in World War II. As I mentioned, nuclear physics is kind of really born at the conjunction. We have the discovery of the electron at that time. Einstein comes up with E equals mc squared, the latter part of the conjunctional period as well, 1905, just sort of at the end. So, what's seeded is atomic physics, and then its kind of ugly fruit comes into being in the 1940s with the atomic bomb. Now, my little theory about this is that you can see that these peaks, right, between 1950 and 1956, And then there's another set of peaks. These are exact sextiles between 1976 and 1986. And then you can see that what happened after 86 is that they started to kind of separate. You can still say they're within six, they're still in orb, but then in this period here, so this is between 1986 and now, there's been this big dip. So they got kind of far away from a sextile in this period.
Right.
And so if you look at this period here between the first set of peaks and the second set of peaks, well, what is this? This is kind of like, this is the Cold War, really. You can see this was the period of time when the US and the USSR were kind of raged against each other, and there was this threat of nuclear war that hung over us through this period. And then 86 was the year of the Chernobyl disaster, but like after this time, and actually 86, by the way, was the year when we had the most number of nuclear weapons in the world. So you can look at the statistics. The maximum number of nukes ever, 86. The last time these two planets made these exact sextiles, then they separate. We get to 1990 here, 91, the USSR falls apart. And that threat of kind of, of nuclear war, it really did go away, didn't it? I mean, we weren't as worried about it. It didn't seem as imminent, even if we still had the weapons.
Right.
But what I've noticed is, I mean, you may have noticed that we're hearing a bit more about nuclear weapons these days. There's been around the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there's this question of like, will Russia use a tactical nuclear weapon and stuff like that? And then, it's much more present in the sort of what we're hearing. And I think it's no coincidence that we are coming back to another set of these exact sextiles between 2026 and 2032. We're come back to this period. And so my little theory really is that it's kind of a recapitulation a little bit of the Cold War period that we might be coming into, where there's this short period. It's not anywhere near as long as the Cold War, but maybe there's going to be some sort of face-off, right, where we get another little Cold War. Hopefully it doesn't explode into something worse than that.
Hopefully.
I mean, I'm hopeful that it won't. I don't think it will, but I think it might feel threatening. There might be some moments where it feels a bit Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, or something like that. There's some, because I'm wondering, if we are to come up with some sort of new settlement where the world doesn't feel like it's kind of at war. This climate now is not very good, right? There's this big kind of a lot of tension in geopolitics and in the world. I mean, I wonder if maybe there's going to be some sort of face-off where there's a question of like, well, look, if we don't come to a settlement here, we're going to end up in nuclear war or something like that. We have to come to a settlement rather than go to that place. And so my hope is that that's the kind of crucible, that's the cauldron that's kind of going to brew this sort of new settlement and maybe a new world. So that would mean that there's kind of a bit of a longer crisis that goes on until early 2030s, mid 2030s, and then it kind of resolve somehow, and then we're kind of, that's just a different kind of theory to Barbeau's vision, and maybe Barbeau is right. Maybe this kind of resolves itself early on. I don't know.